Hey friends, Chris here. Now for those of you new here, I'm a former chemist, a failed professional cyclist, and now a chef at a Michelin-starred restaurant. And this video is incredibly exciting for me, and I think it will be for you too, because it sits right at the interface of science, health, and cooking. And you should be interested in at least one of those. Now you would think that knowing what the human body is made of is something we would have figured out by now, but there's still some debate around how much of us is actually human. But we do know that the majority of it is not, probably. So what's the rest of it, and why should you care? Well, the largest part of our body by cell number and genetic information is the so-called microbiome. And its composition has a bigger effect on your health than even your own DNA, so it's incredibly important that you look after it. In this video, we're going to introduce the microbiome and have a look at its importance and its influence, particularly when it comes to diet and health and well-being. But since this is a cooking channel, there's another interesting question we have to answer. Does the microbiome influence what we find delicious? Well, it just might. Let me explain. Now, our understanding of ourselves as a species has changed dramatically over the last few decades. Advances in the biological sciences and the ability to analyze the information have allowed us to question more deeply what it is to be human. It's long known that microbes, viruses, and fungi consider our bodies home, and they can be found almost everywhere in the human body. And depending on how you measure it, they are more numerous than our own cells. And recent studies suggest that for every 1 part human, we are 1.3 part other things. But no one is sure, and if you think it would be a simple task just to count some cells, well, you can join me in being wrong. But more relevant than their number is how this community of microbes, fungi, and viruses interact with us, and passive, they're certainly not. So the microbiome is able to influence this in a number of ways. One of them is the neurocrine system, which is the nervous system, the endocrine system, which is our hormonal system, and also the immune system, collectively known together as the gut-brain axis. So research in this area is really quite young and limited, but already studies are showing that the microbiome is able to influence brain development, with emotional learning and memory processes all affected. So scientists are finding that the microbiome and our gut health are very strongly linked to the etiology, which is a posh word for the cause and progression of disease, for things like Parkinson's and other chronic diseases, IBS, chronic fatigue, depression, anxiety, even autism and chronic pain, and these are seemingly modulated through the gut-brain axis. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of growing interest in this area as it's linked to so many areas of our life and qualities of life that we find so important. And this research is leading us to rethink a lot of our understanding around aging and development, healthy or otherwise, and ultimately what makes us us. And so intertwined is this microbiome with us that to think of ourselves as a single species is becoming less relevant. Humans are a complex assemblage of many living species and an expression of all of them that have come together, that have co-evolved and coexisted together for millions of years, a so-called holobiont. The idea of a holobiont comes from other host-symbiont relationships.
Indeed. Indeed.
Only it's expanded to account for its really complex and multitudinous nature. And so the question of what do you want for dinner comes a bit more interesting because it may not be entirely up to you. So the added complexity of the microbiome to our own genetic variation makes the study of nutrition probably one of the hardest sciences to work in because we are all so different, and so the ability to be able to do an objective test becomes very difficult. So for example, according to research, a handful of almonds could give me 58 calories. That is, when I eat them, my body receives 58 calories, while yours might get 168. It's incredibly hard to get concise, clean results. And often the best you can ask for a question like, should I drink red wine is, well, it depends. Now, every one of us are different by huge margins because the microbiome actually contains more genetic material than our own body, although that's perhaps not surprising. But what is that the genetic content of the microbiome is a greater determinant of our health than our own genetics. So this is a really hard scientific problem. And how do you even begin to pick this apart? With so many interacting things, understanding the mechanism and the absolute cause of something becomes incredibly difficult because a result is the effect of many things putting together that, each one by itself, you can't really make that connection, but together they have this effect. But some very smart people are working it out. And Tim Spector is one of them, author of The Diet Myth, and also co-founder of a company called Zoe. Now, of all the scientists and politicians involved with the government's COVID response, Tim Spector is one of the few who didn't disgrace themselves. And while Matt Hancock was awkwardly kissing women outside of his marriage, Tim was getting busy with Zoe. Now, you may have already heard of Zoe, and in fact, Zoe have got really good experience with public health, and their study of COVID symptoms is the biggest public health study in history. Now look, this isn't an ad. I mean, obviously I've got 57 followers. But this is the Zoe kit that will test my microbiome, my blood sugar response to food, and also my blood lipids. And all of that will be put together and put through AI, which will make connections between foods that I eat, the composition of my microbiome, how I respond to them, how others respond to them, and then it will produce a very individual and personalized recommendation of foods that are good for me. So now we understand what the microbiome is, and it's important towards our well-being and health. But what about deliciousness? Now, one of the more general lessons that comes out of Tim Spector's book is that diversity in our diet is a very, very good thing. And that is that we want to aim to eat around 100 or so foods that are different a week. And foods that do particularly well are fermented foods, because they also contain microbes, but because of the action of the microbes, they are molecularly more complex. And that is, it turns out, a good thing. Dark chocolate, coffee, olive oil, yogurt, red wine, all of these cheeses, all of these things are really good for us in moderation, of course. Now, it seems to me that there is a huge overlap between what we learn to find delicious and what is good for our microbiome. And I'll repeat that, it's what we learn to find delicious. Now, obviously, we all find sugary, fatty things as incredibly delicious from a very young age, and that's because they are sources of energy. And often we show very little control in eating them. Now, many of the complex, delicious foods that we enjoy, we turned our noses up as kids. Like, how many 6-year-olds are drinking dark black coffee without sugar or milk? Think dark chocolate, red wine, bitter leaf greens, Marmite, and some never even lose their hate of Marmite. Not me though, I love it. Now, all of these are associated with bitter tastes and initial aversion to them, but also very strongly associated with health. Now, these foods are incredibly good for the health of the microbiome and therefore also for us. And they contain many complex compounds and a mixture of these compounds like anthocyanins, alkaloids, and polyphenols. Now, this is highly speculative, but it's possible that the microbiome can influence what we find delicious. Now, a diverse diet has been shown to be really good for our microbiome and our overall health, and foods that are complex in their composition have also been shown to be so good for our microbiome. Again, chocolate, coffee, and wine, for example, and contain anthocyanins, polyphenols, alkaloids, many flavor and other aroma molecules, tend to be incredibly good for us. And yet we tend to turn our noses up to them when we're younger. So my question is, can the microbiome influence us over time to seek out and prefer these foods that we initially turn our noses up to? Now, there's an idea in biology which is called the niche construction, and this is where an organism or a collection of organisms can act to improve its environment and therefore its chances of survival. Examples of this are acidifying bacteria, which by acidifying their environment, it renders it more difficult for other bacteria and competitors to survive. And so they've greatly improved their environment and chances towards their own success. Okay, so we have these two ideas. We have that of a niche construction, which is the ability of an organism or collection of organisms to positively change its environment. And there's also this idea that the microbiome can influence our own processing through hormonal and the nervous system and the immune system. So there is both a mechanism, that is, there is a way, and there is also a motivation for this to happen. But there is an obvious problem with this idea, and that is that sugar is something that is really bad for the microbiome, and it actually reduces the diversity and reduces the health of the microbiome. But we have a very strong preference for it, and also we can even crave it and seek out these sweetness, and we can become addicted to them. Although in some way we are hardwired to seek out sugar and energy, and so it's not surprising that this isn't necessarily overruled. But one thing I wanted to suggest is this, that things that we find truly delicious, that is things, not sweet things that are, they're like instant gratification, but things that we find truly delicious and like rewarding to have eaten and almost emotional at times, that they taste so good, tend to be things that are complex or have gone through complex processes or contain a complex mixture of these compounds that are incredibly good for our microbiome. And I think that's in part due to the effect of the microbiome on our taste preferences. Now, our preferences for food reflect our genetics, our culture, our family, and the 10,000 microbes that live within us. And with so many interested parties and participants, it's fascinating to me that we don't end up with a noise from a committee that can't agree on anything, but what we end up with is this huge agreement between us and this symphony of taste. So to bring this all together, and what I'm really excited about is that there is, regardless of how it happens, there's a massive overlap between foods that we find delicious and foods, and I mean genuinely delicious, and foods that are good for us. And it's not one or the other. You can have this incredibly delicious food that's so incredibly good for you, and you can live better, you can enjoy your food more. And I don't think this isn't really anything new. I think we've gone through this phase where we've had all these sugary processed things and they hack our brain to some sense for us to like them. But now it needn't be a trade-off to have a food that's really delicious but it's really bad for us. You know, in fact, I would suggest that foods that are incredibly good for us become the most delicious through our learned preference. And that, for me, means that cooking takes on an even deeper importance. And I can't wait to look into this more in future videos. And if this is the kind of thing that you enjoy, and if you like this video, you know what you need to do. And I'll see you in the next one.